October 14, 1993, 5:43 a.m., Queens, New York. The city remained shrouded in the hush of early morning as Carol Williams closed her apartment door behind her. Outside, New York was just waking up. The muted rumble of garbage trucks, the murmur of streetlights giving way to dawn, and the distant smell of bread baking in neighborhood bakeries. For Carol and people like her, the day had already started. Security video from her lobby building catches her looking at her watch, fiddling with the strap of her bag, and then walking out into the cool October air. Her white nurse's shoes created a steady beat on the sidewalk as she walked towards the subway station, which was 3 blocks away. The cool breeze had the scent of autumn, and she hunched into her jacket around her shoulders. At 5:47 a.m., a corner store camera snapped her, making her customary stop for coffee. The clerk informed detectives later that she was among the friendliest regulars, always courteous, always in a hurry, always alive. 5 minutes earlier, at 5:52 a.m., another camera caught her entering the subway station. And then, nothing. Carol Williams disappeared. Poof, is no more. For 3 decades, that fleeting instant, a young nurse vanishing into Queens tunnels, was the last anyone would ever lay eyes on her. No corpse, no crime scene, no resolution. Not until now. What investigators uncovered 3 decades later would leave even the most seasoned detectives shaken. The truth had been sitting in plain sight the whole time, and the person behind Carol's disappearance wasn't some faceless stranger lurking in the shadows. It was someone she knew, someone she trusted, someone who had been quietly watching her all along. Hey there, true crime family. Today we're diving into one of the most haunting cold cases in New York City's history. A case that baffled detectives for generations and ended with a revelation no one saw coming. This isn't a missing person story. It's a story about a predator who preyed upon innocence, a man who utilized charm and authority to conceal his actions, a man whose respectability mask deceived a community. If you think you've heard this tale before, trust me, you haven't. Before we dive in, please subscribe and enable notifications. We provide you with in-depth research true crime cases twice a week, and you won't want to miss the next one, believe me. Your support in keeping those stories alive, to give the victims justice and give their stories the attention they've long deserved, is what keeps us going. Now get your coffee, sit back, and join me in the spine-tingling tale of how a landlord, Harold Brennan, kept his blackest secret for 3 decades, and how the single-minded investigation of one detective finally delivered justice for Carol Williams. Carol's day started like any other workday. The 28-year-old nurse had relocated to Queens from upstate New York 2 years ago, beaming with pride after getting a job at Presbyterian Hospital. Her friends painted a picture of her as meticulous, caring, and extremely detail-oriented, qualities that made her an outstanding nurse. Ironically enough, the same characteristics would later assist detectives in piecing together her last hours. But what is particularly horrifying about this case isn't just what was done to Carol. It's how close the killer remained thereafter. While detectives worked through leads and Carol's relatives posted missing posters throughout Queens, Harold Brennan, the landlord of the building, was ubiquitous. He volunteered to mobilize search parties. He reassured Carol's distraught sister. He even appeared on local television, the role of outraged neighbor. All along, he knew exactly what became of her. Tonight, we're going to unravel how this case went cold, how new technology reignited it, and how a string of tiny mistakes led to the downfall of a man who thought he'd committed the perfect crime. Before we proceed, where are you watching from tonight? Share your location in the comments. You might be surprised by how many of our viewers have made connections to long-forgotten local cases through these features. Who knows? Your input could illuminate another cold case. Now let's turn the clock back to 1993 and go back to Carol Williams' last days, before she was the subject of one of New York's most baffling vanishings. Carol Williams was more than a name in a folder or a face on a missing person poster. Before she was the subject of one of New York's most eerie enigmas, she was a daughter, a sister, a devoted friend, and most of all, a healer. Brought up in Buffalo, Carol naturally found herself at ease taking care of others. Her mother was a receptionist at a neighborhood clinic, and during summer breaks, young Carol would join her there. Most children might have considered the sterile walls and antiseptic odor dull, but not Carol. She was fascinated. By the time she was 8, her dolls had medical charts and her stuffed animals had miniature homemade bandages. She wasn't acting like a nurse. She was rehearsing. Her brother Michael once explained to reporters, "It wasn't a career choice for Carol. It was a calling." After graduating magna cum laude from SUNY Buffalo's nursing program in 1991, Carol made her move to the big city. New York in the early 90s bore little resemblance to the sleek skyline we recognize today. Crime was rampant. Neighborhoods were reeling from the crack epidemic, and the AIDS epidemic continued to ravage lives. But to Carol, they weren't excuses not to come, excuses to arrive. She got a job at Presbyterian Hospital in Manhattan, treating HIV/AIDS patients during an era when fear and stigma frequently overwhelmed compassion. Her colleagues recalled her as a person who treated each individual with dignity and gentleness, regardless of background. Dr. Marcus Reynolds, who collaborated with her extensively, phrased it most eloquently. She was old-fashioned. Not in her medicine, she was bright and ever learning, but in her conviction that kindness counted as much as ability. Carol's own life was plain, a one-bedroom apartment in Astoria, Queens, a short time ago still a blue-collar neighborhood on its way toward the thriving community of today. She had discovered the apartment via a newspaper ad and had believed she had hit the jackpot. Reasonable rent, peaceful neighbors, and an attentive landlord. That landlord was Harold Brennan. In retrospect, warning signs were present, but so subtle that no one, not even Carol, could have anticipated danger. Brennan visited to fix things in her apartment more times than he visited anyone else. He'd remark on her clothes, her hair, her smile. Small things that, at the time, seemed only uncomfortable, but later sent shivers down the backs of investigators. Sometimes Carol mentioned to friends that she felt like someone in the building was watching her, but she'd laugh it off, blaming her nerves on living alone in a big city. October 14th, 1993, started like any other Thursday. Carol's alarm had been set at 5:15 a.m. for her 7 a.m. work shift. Her planner, subsequently discovered tidily on her kitchen counter, listed that she'd scheduled a haircut after work and was going to call her mom in the evening. Typical plans for what was supposed to be a typical day. The chronology that proceeded, constructed laboriously from surveillance tape and eyewitness testimony, seemed painfully mundane before it wasn't. 5:43 a.m. Carol exits her apartment complex. 5:47 a.m. She purchases her usual coffee at the corner bodega. 5:52 a.m. She boards the 30th Avenue subway station. 5:55 a.m. A subway employee remembers that he saw a woman who looked like her on the platform. And then, nothing. When Carol failed to report for work, her boss thought she was sick. But when repeated calls went unanswered by the evening, a coworker contacted her family. By dawn, her brother Michael was driving down from Buffalo, eager to locate his sister. He made a missing persons report that morning. The NYPD acted quickly. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, spoke to commuters, and scoured every minute of available surveillance. Carol's apartment was pristine. Her bed made, dishes clean, her uniform for the next day set out. Her ID and purse were gone, but her bags remained intact. There were no cash withdrawals, no credit card purchases. It was as if she'd vanished from the face of the earth somewhere between her door and the hospital. Detective Frank Moretti, who was one of the first to work on the case, later remarked, "People don't just disappear in a city with millions of eyes, but somehow she did." The search for her was quickly at an impasse. Cameras at the subway stop covered only the entrance. Nothing past the turnstiles. Nobody had witnessed her take a train. Nobody had overheard a fight. It was a ghost trail, and with each new day, hope of Carol's return faded a fraction more. The Queens morning rush brought dozens of commuters sweeping through the same streets, the same subway door. But no one recalled anything out of the ordinary that morning. No fight, no cry, no scuffle. Just another Thursday morning. A K-9 unit was called in, and for one instant it looked as if there could be a lead. The dog scented Carol from the subway station, but rather than continuing underground, the trail went back out onto the street. Then, at an intersection, it ended. as if she'd disappeared into the throngs of people. As weeks passed into days, speculation started. Some detectives asked themselves whether she'd become the victim of a serial predator who hunted women in the subway system. Others speculated that perhaps, just perhaps, she decided to leave. But that wasn't a notion anyone who knew her could accept. Carol's life was good, her work satisfying, and her future busy with plans. She wasn't the sort to bolt. Even rumor had her disappearance related to her job, a grieving or irate family member of a patient she had treated. Only weeks before, Carol had assisted in the care of a particularly contentious end-of-life case, one that had caused friction among relatives. Along the way, Harold Brennan, the owner, was always in sight. He let police scour the building, repeatedly. He personally distributed flyers with Carol's photograph. He even offered a small reward for information leading to her whereabouts. In winter newspaper photographs, Brennan is standing gravely by Carol's brother at candlelight vigils. Head down, a visage of worry. To those around him, he seemed like just another decent neighbor waiting for answers. The reaction of the community was nothing less than incredible. Search parties were put together by Carol's fellow nurses. Local diners and shops posted her photo in their windows. Even in a city desensitized by daily crime stories, Carol's vanishing act made an impact. "It could have been any of us," said Diane Rodriguez, a neighbor who lived 2 floors below Carol. "That's what made it so scary. She did everything right. She wasn't out late. She wasn't in a dangerous place. She was just going to work in the morning like thousands of other people." By the month of December 1993, though, the pressure had started to dissipate. With all their efforts, there were no leads. The NYPD discreetly allocated resources to newer cases. Carol's family, tired and battered, went back to Buffalo. They packed up her apartment, tediously boxing her belongings but unable to work up the motive to unpack them at home. As far as anyone was concerned, Carol Williams was a specter, alive only in pictures, memories, and a slender NYPD file that would soon go into a state of suspended animation for almost 30 years. The case had begun as a highest priority. After all, a young nurse who went missing on her daily commute was the sort of random tragedy that frightens an entire city. But in New York, where new crimes come in from the streets every day, even the most dedicated detectives can only keep going for so long before the next crisis needs their attention. This is how the investigation gradually descended into silence. The first week was chaos. Detectives Susan Ramirez and Frank Moretti handled the case, working almost around the clock. They interviewed 37 tenants in Carol's building, 14 of her hospital colleagues, and scores of subway workers and riders. Flyers with Carol's photo covered the neighborhood. The story led nightly newscasts. Police divers combed the East River, following an anonymous tip that Carol's body had been thrown in. The search yielded nothing. An alleged eyewitness reported having seen Carol fight with a male outside the subway entrance, but later retracted after video evidence showed their timing didn't hold water. The case remained under investigation, but the cracks were forming. Detective Ramirez was reallocated to a triple homicide uptown. The case was moved to the missing persons squad, where Detective Moretti continued to press on, albeit now handling an increasingly long list of other missing people. On December 7th, the NYPD had one final press conference. The crowd was thin. Carol's name still showed up in passing references on the nightly news, but the holidays ushered in a fresh round of violent crimes, and the media forgot. The case became officially cold. It was kept open on paper, but in reality, it went silent. Too silent. Monthly visits to the family became quarterly, then yearly. "We never lost hope," Detective Moretti said years later in a 2020 interview. "But without fresh evidence, it's like chasing a shadow through time." "But we were out of places to check," said Detective Frank Moretti once. "Each lead we pursued just disappeared. It was like trying to catch smoke, and that's where the investigation had ended up, an all-consuming quest that went nowhere." The evidence gathered in those initial months was copious, but infuriatingly ambiguous. Carol's apartment yielded nothing extraordinary. Fingerprints within were only hers and Harold Brennan, the landlord. Little surprise, considering he had access to the building. Her diary, discovered discreetly placed beside the bed, reported being uncomfortable in the building, twice that September, but didn't clarify why. The security footage at the bodega had Carol behaving normally. No distress, no one behind her. Her entry on the subway camera was that she entered alone. Her phone records were nothing out of the ordinary, and her final call, a chatty call with her mother, ended at around 9 p.m. the night before she vanished. There was one tiny enigma, though, one unknown fingerprint on her bathroom windowsill. It didn't match anyone in the database, and in 1993, without the DNA testing as sophisticated as today's, that print was just one more maddening dead end. No one could have imagined that years later it would be the key to solving the whole case. But at the time, what was most striking was what was missing. No body, no blood, no crime scene, no witnesses to an abduction. It was as if Carol had walked into the subway and just disappeared. By spring 1994, the city had moved on. New York's tabloids were obsessed with a celebrity murder trial. Summer saw a spate of gang violence overwhelm police budgets. The eerie tale of one missing nurse, no matter how sad, was quietly forgotten. Media has a predictable cycle with missing persons cases, said Alicia Martinez, a journalism professor at NYU. There's an initial intense coverage, particularly if the victim is from a specific demographic. But without some new development, public interest wanes. It's not cruelty, it's the beat of the news cycle. For Carol's family, that waning interest was its own heartbreak. "It's like she died twice," her mother said to a Buffalo paper in 1995. "Once when she disappeared, and again when people stopped talking about her." But some people didn't forget. Detective Moretti kept Carol's picture tacked to the bulletin board beside his desk for the remainder of his career. Even after he retired in 2008, he'd dig out her file every now and then, call a few old contacts, check a few names over again, motivated not by instruction, but by conscience. In the meantime, Harold Brennan remained exactly where he'd always been, behind the scenes running his apartment complex and building up his real estate holdings gradually. To anyone inquiring, he was simply an upstanding landlord who just happened to have lost a tenant in tragic fashion. Every so often, he'd inquire of old detectives if there were any news on poor Carol, always with the proper expression of regret, never prying, never suspicious. In 1998, the detectives made a brief return to the case when another young woman disappeared in the area. But that lead went nowhere, no connection. In 2003, a jail informant said he knew what became of Carol, but under interrogation, his tale disintegrated. By the 10th anniversary of her vanishing, Carol's case was down to a brief paragraph in the Queens local paper. The 20th anniversary, in 2013, came and went without even that. Carol Williams was a ghost now, her tale told in hushed tones by young nurses in Presbyterian Hospital as a warning, and remembered vaguely by longtime residents of Astoria who still spoke of that poor girl who disappeared. But for her family, the hurt never faded. Imagine you were investigating this case. What would you have done? I'll pose to you, true crime family. What's a clue that detectives may have overlooked? Share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes, even decades after the fact, a new pair of eyes can cast new light on an old enigma. "Not knowing is what kills you," said Carol's mother, Margaret Williams, in an unusual 2015 interview. "Death is tragic, but at least there's closure. This purgatory, it's like living in hell where you can't wake up." For the Williams family, Carol's case wasn't a distant file. It was an open wound. Even as the official probe ground to a halt, their own search never ceased. Michael Williams, Carol's older brother, went on a leave from his accounting work in the months after her disappearance. He leased a small apartment in Queens, resolved to track her down. Each day, he patrolled the streets with her picture in hand, approaching strangers, holding up her face, asking the same devastating question day after day: "Have you seen my sister?" Michael covered every possible route his sister could have traveled that morning. He patrolled the same streets she used to, went to homeless shelters, scoured hospital records throughout all 5 boroughs for any sign of her. "I kept hoping that around the next corner she'd be standing there," he whispered years later. "Maybe she had forgotten. Maybe she was just lost." The mind imagines these impossible things because the truth is too terrible to confront. Their father, Robert Williams, a soft-spoken Vietnam veteran, channeled his sorrow into action. He established a small foundation in Carol's honor, giving nursing students scholarships. But most significantly, the foundation underwrote annual billboard advertisements that kept Carol's face in the public sphere. Every October, those foreboding words plastered throughout Queens. Do you know what happened to Carol? Margaret Williams, Carol's mother, dealt with it differently. She dove into support groups for missing persons' families, individuals who knew the odd, bottomless pain of not knowing. She became an activist, lobbying lawmakers for more robust cold case resources and pushing police departments to create specialist units. The police didn't give up on Carol, Margaret explained once. They just had boundaries, budgets, manpower, other cases. But we didn't have those limits. We could keep searching because we had to. Every year on the anniversary of Carol's birthday, the family came together to commemorate in quiet. They grew old. She did not. In photographs of those memorials, the differences are evident. Margaret's hair went white, Robert's originally straight shoulders hunched over with age, Michael's face etched with loss. And there in each picture sat the same framed portrait of Carol, ageless 28, ageless lost. If this story touches you, please like this video for a minute. It brings Carol's story to the masses and reminds the world that for every cold case, there is a family still waiting for answers. And speaking of cold cases, the statistics are astonishing. The National Missing and Unidentified Person System reports that more than 600,000 individuals go missing in the U.S. each and every year. Most are recovered alive, thank goodness. But thousands go missing for months, years, sometimes decades. As of 2023, over 13,000 unidentified bodies are in the national database. And even more chilling, an estimated 250,000 unresolved homicides date back to the 1960s. That's 250,000 families like the Williams, stuck in the misery of not knowing. For the Williams family, the years were merciless milestones. In 2008, Robert Williams died of heart failure. He died from a broken heart, Margaret spoke softly. 15 years of not knowing ate away at him, little by little. By 2013, the 20th anniversary of Carol's vanishing, the family had a bittersweet choice to make. They had a memorial, not a funeral. Margaret was adamant about the difference. It wasn't a matter of giving up. It was a way of celebrating Carol's life. People said it would help us move on, Michael remembered. But you don't move on from something like that. You just learn to carry it differently. Margaret never changed her phone number, not even once in 30 years, even after she moved a few times. In case she tries to call home, she'd say matter-of-factly. Each night before bed, she made sure the ringer was on. Some scars don't heal with time, some questions won't go away, and some families, like the Williams, won't let the world forget. Then came January 2020. The NYPD Cold Case Squad office buzzed with the familiar cadence of muted anger and persistent hope. Detectives combed through stacks of old evidence, knowing full well that most of these enigmas would remain unsolved. But one detective, Olivia Ramirez, felt an inexplicable pull toward a specific case file, Carol Williams. Not given to me, Ramirez testified later, but something in her picture, that smile, that glint in her eyes, I couldn't turn away. No body, no witnesses, no closure. Occasionally, it isn't the latest evidence that cracks a case. It's the one officer who chooses not to turn away. Detective Olivia Ramirez, a 15-year veteran of the NYPD with a reputation for dogged determination, had no vested interest in the original case. She'd been a child living in the Bronx when Carol Williams vanished. But when she cracked open that yellowed old case file, something began to stir within her. She couldn't dispel the sense that the answers were there, hidden beneath time, ready to be unearthed. Cold cases aren't just about justice, Ramirez later said. They're about giving families peace, finally answering the questions that have haunted them for decades. The Williams family deserved that much. By 2020, forensic science was a whole new landscape from where it was in 1993. What was once impossible was now routine. DNA analysis had become light years more advanced than it was in the early days. Even a few microscopically thin skin cells could point a finger at a suspect. Digital forensics could extract information from wrecked devices or clean up decades-old surveillance footage to crystal clear. And along came genetic genealogy, a revolutionary method that employed public DNA databases to identify relatives of unidentified suspects. A single hit was all it took to track a killer back through generations. For Carol's case, however, the greatest game changer was fingerprint analysis. In the 90s, detectives required 12 to 16 perfect match points to validate an ID. Today, sophisticated AI could identify matches from partial prints previously considered worthless. Ramirez started by painstakingly documenting each shred of physical evidence still on hand from the case. Carol's hairbrush, her clothes, fingerprints taken from her bathroom window, even the original VHS surveillance tapes, which she had spent hours digitizing before they deteriorated entirely. But one item stood out, that single unidentified fingerprint found on Carol's bathroom window frame. Back in 1993, it hadn't matched anyone in the system. Still, it had been carefully preserved. Ramirez sent it to the FBI's Next Generation Identification System, a massive database containing millions more profiles than existed 3 decades earlier. Meanwhile, she directed a fresh round of DNA testing on objects from Carol's apartment. Door handles, window latches, and personal items that were supposed to have only Carol's DNA on them. Technology provides us with better tool, Ramirez said, but good detective work is still about asking the right questions. Who had access to her apartment? Who knew her schedule? And who managed to remain invisible all these years? The breakthrough occurred in March 2021. The new fingerprint analysis did not point to a specific suspect, but it did point to a familial link to a print on a man arrested for voyeurism in 2017. Timothy Brennan, nephew of none other than Harold Brennan, former landlord of Carol. It wasn't evidence, not quite, but it was sufficient to ring alarm bells. Harold Brennan had lived quietly in the same neighborhood all these years, continuing to manage rental properties, continuing to adopt that image of the friendly, responsible landlord. Sometimes, Ramirez said, the most apparent suspect is the one hiding in plain sight. Brennan possessed the means, access to Carol's apartment building. He possessed the knowledge, what she did when she did it, and from the beginning he had insinuated himself into the investigation, asking questions sufficient to seem helpful, without ever appearing suspicious. With Brennan now firmly in her crosshairs, Ramirez returned to the old tapes. She processed the footage this time with newer software. On a 1993 subway entrance tape, grainy decades ago, investigators had previously discarded. A blur of a figure stood near the entrance around 40 minutes prior to Carol's arrival. The stance, the build. The similarity to Harold Brennan was difficult to overlook. Then arrived the revelation that shook everything. While executing a search warrant on Brennan's office in April 2022, investigators discovered a concealed storage room. Neatly labeled boxes, each bearing an address of a building he rented out, were found inside. But one box caught their eyes, Carol's former apartment number. Inside, police detectives discovered chilling evidence. Things that belonged to Carol, her hospital identification tag, a distinctive gold bracelet her mother had last seen, and most eerily, a tiny diary that no one in her family even knew she had written. Some killers keep trophies, Ramirez later explained, but Brennan, he kept records. Organized, labeled, preserved. Almost as though he were gathering evidence against himself. More excavating revealed something even more sinister and considerably more unsettling than anyone had anticipated. In that secret storage closet, police discovered additional boxes. Not only one marked with Carol's apartment number, but multiple, each with the address of another building owned by Brennan. Inside those boxes, police discovered personal items, diaries, and minute personal objects, all belonging to women who once occupied his apartments. 5 of them had complained of odd things happening to them over the years. 3 had fled in a hurry after awkward experiences with their landlord, and 2, ominously, had vanished, their disappearances never connected to Brennan before now. The cold case that lay untouched for almost 30 years was suddenly red hot. Did you ever track a cold case that was ultimately solved? What was it about the story that struck you? The mystery, the injustice, or the sheer determination of those who wouldn't give up? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The true crime community has a strong role in keeping these tales alive, frequently long after official inquiries turn cold. At the age of 67, Harold Brennan had established what appeared to be a flawless life in Astoria, Queens, when he was arrested in 2022. To his neighbors, subtenants, and coworkers, he was the epitome of a diligent, trustworthy man. A self-made owner who had begun with a small operation in the 1980s and expanded his empire to 7 clean, modestly sized apartment buildings throughout Queens. He was the kind of landlord who remembered your kids' names, recalled former tenant Maria Vasquez. He'd show up to fix a leaky faucet himself, drop off Christmas cookies in December. You'd never think twice about him. Brennan was an active member of his community, serving on the local Business Improvement District Board, donating to charity drives, and helping with neighborhood cleanups. His reputation was spotless. He remained celibate, habitually teasing that he'd married his work following a heartbreak in his early years. He went to church Sundays, kept the same practical sedan for decades, and dressed like the very character out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Sweater vests, iron slacks, and that very courteous half-smile. It was an ideal cover. Looking back, Detective Ramirez said afterward, his ordinariness was his camouflage. Nobody suspects the friendly middle-aged landlord who waves to you every morning. Behind that mild-mannered facade was a calculated predator, a man who had honed a method for hunting and dominating the women who trusted him. Investigators reconstructed a chilling pattern. Step 1. Brennan personally selected his tenants, typically single women in their mid-20s to mid-30s who worked lengthy, unorthodox hours in caregiving fields such as nursing, teaching, or social work. These were women of disciplined routine and extended periods away from home. Step 2, he provided security upgrades, allegedly to make them feel safer. In fact, the upgrades involved hidden cameras in the form of smoke detectors, locks he could access with a master key, and in a few cases, tiny peepholes drilled through walls, hidden behind picture frames in the adjacent room. Step 3, he wrote it all down. Investigators would subsequently discover journals where Brennan had monitored his tenants' comings and goings in exquisite detail. When they went to work, who stopped by, even what they ordered for takeout. This wasn't on the spur of the moment, said forensic psychologist Dr. Rebecca Sloan, who had studied the case. Brennan wasn't coming from a place of sudden anger or fixation. He was calculating. This was control, power, and voyeurism, stretched out over years with low risk. For most of his victims, the invasion went unnoticed. Just subtle, unsettling hints that something wasn't right. A picture slightly moved, a door left unlocked, a lingering sense of being watched, easily dismissed as urban anxiety. Some women moved out early, unable to explain their unease. Others stayed, never realizing their landlord held their spare keys and their secrets. What changed Brennan from peeping Tom to something much worse is unclear. Detectives think Carol Williams may have started to pay attention, to notice things, discrepancies, unusual feelings, perhaps even signs of interference. Her diary's cryptic mention of not feeling at ease in the building may have been the first intimation she had him pegged, and maybe she had it out with him. That, detectives now suspect, might have sealed her doom. The exposure of Harold Brennan's enormous stalking network struck the community with a thunderclap. For decades, he had gone stealthily among them, mending leaky faucets, waving at neighbors, distributing holiday treats, while covertly documenting the lives of the women he stalked. Detectives soon had at least 17 women who had been in his care between 1985 and 2022 listed out, each one chronicled in his macabrely detailed records. The records were so systematic, so appallingly systematized, that detectives could track exactly when Brennan started observing each woman, what he noticed, and when his focus shifted to the next. Among the 17 were 5 women who reported to the police strange or creepy things happening in their apartments. Doors unlocking, things moving, the feeling of being watched. Those reports, however, were never linked. Various precincts, various years, Separately, they were nothing more than minor grievances. Collectively, they were a terrifying scenario. Worse still, authorities found evidence implicating Brennan in two other disappearances. Lucia Mendez, a kindergarten teacher who disappeared in 1999, and Aisha Johnson, a social worker who was last seen in 2008. Both were Brennan's renters. Both investigations had gone cold. And both women's personal items, necklaces, notebooks, even small mementos their families had reported missing, were discovered, neatly tagged in Brennan's storage containers. If this case gives you the chills like it does me, let's take a moment. What warning signs may have been overlooked? What patterns can we, as a community, learn to spot before something like this occurs again? Share your ideas below, because sometimes awareness is the best way to prevent. Now here's what really unsettled investigators. Whereas most offenders maintain trophies out of obligation or affective ties, Brennan's collection was surprisingly methodical. Every item was washed, labeled, dated, and stored in airtight bags. Maintenance visits were noted, ingress into apartments was recorded, and even adjustments to hidden cameras were noted. It wasn't a stash of souvenirs, said NYPD Captain James Morris. It was a controlled archive, like something you'd see in a museum or a lab. He wasn't driven by emotion, he was preserving evidence. The storage room itself was equally unsettling, equipped with temperature controls, air filtration, and even backup power to prevent deterioration of his collection. In my 20 years of law enforcement, Captain Morris said, I've never seen anything like it. It was as if he wanted his crimes to outlive him. Perfectly documented, perfectly intact. But what made this case even more disturbing was how Brennan manipulated the very investigations chasing him. When Carol Williams vanished, Brennan didn't merely act the role of concerned landlord. He became a member of the search party. He distributed flyers, consoled neighbors, and offered police tips that quietly steered them off track. He instructed police to investigate a former maintenance employee he'd terminated, Detective Ramirez described, then spoke of a suspicious van he'd allegedly spotted outside the building. He even raised suspicions about Carol's ex-boyfriend in Buffalo, implying their breakup hadn't been as amicable as everyone believed. Each tip went nowhere. Each one ate up precious police time, and each one reinforced Brennan's reputation as a willing citizen. A ghastly pattern began to emerge. He had done the same thing in Lucia Mendez and Aisha Johnson's investigations, positioning himself as a benevolent landlord while subtly nudging detectives down blind alleys. Delving further into his history, Ramirez's investigators discovered Brennan's real estate career began with an inheritance from an aunt in 1983. The same year a young woman went missing from the building he'd inherited. That one was never solved. Now detectives say it was his first victim. We believe he's been operating about 40 years, Ramirez said, and the reality is, he could have continued indefinitely if technology hadn't finally reached him. The peaceful Astoria streets came alive as a dozen unmarked police cars encircled Brennan's humble two-story house. Tactical officers positioned themselves at either end. Detective Ramirez and her team walked up to the front entrance. The timing was not coincidental. Early morning, the same time Carol Williams had disappeared almost 3 decades earlier. Brennan had opened the door in a bathrobe, confusion crossing his face as he absorbed the scene. When Ramirez moved forward holding out a search warrant, his face changed in an instant, confusion giving way to something else. He knew, Ramirez said. As soon as he saw that sheet of paper, something shifted in his eyes. Not anger, not fear, acceptance, like he'd been waiting for this moment. The arrest was tranquil, almost surreal. No chase, no fight, only silent surrender. He went quietly, as if he finally realized that his many years' dark secret had reached its conclusion. Brennan did not struggle or yell as officers advanced. He just bent his head and let them cuff him. All he said, the police reported, was chillingly matter-of-fact. I suppose you found my files. In his house, investigators found what they would later characterize as a command center of espionage, a secret world painstakingly crafted for watching and controlling. One of the bedrooms had been repurposed as a surveillance center, walls covered with screens displaying live footage from several properties that he owned. Filing cabinets were filled with handwritten logs, monitoring the day-to-day activities of dozens of women tenants across decades. And then the true terror, an undisclosed room hidden behind a concealment wall in his closet. Within, rows and rows of tidy piles of storage containers, each with a name and address typed on it. The one labeled Williams C193 would at last reveal the tale detectives had pursued for 3 decades. It contained Carol's hospital identification badge, her apartment keys, a lock of hair sealed in plastic, and, most incriminating of all, a journal filled with Brennan's neat, careful script. There he detailed it all, accompanying Carol into the subway station that morning in October, confronting her for snooping through maintenance spaces, and, when she said she was going to report him, murdering her in a maintenance tunnel. He even detailed how he buried her body at a New Jersey construction site, now buried under a shopping mall. Recovery efforts there persist to this day. When word broke on the news of Brennan's arrest, it rocked the community. Old neighbors were shocked. The quiet, courteous landlord they knew suddenly was revealed to be a cunning predator. Former renters started reliving their encounters with him. Little incidents now revealed as sinister. "He always kind of seemed to know when I'd be home," said Rebecca Torres, who leased from Brennan in 2015. "I used to catch little things get rearranged, but I talked myself into being paranoid about it. Now I find myself thinking about what could have happened if I'd spoken up." The case took over national news. Journalists, criminologists, and psychologists wanted to know the same thing. How was it possible for a person to keep this level of evil concealed in plain view for almost 4 decades? "For offenders such as Brennan," said forensic psychologist Dr. Ela Whitford, "the key is imitation. They learn normal behavior and execute it perfectly. To be nice but insignificant is the ultimate cover." Within a few days, the NYPD established a special hotline for anyone who had ever rented from Brennan. The call volume was flooded. 23 women called up to report strange occurrences, inexplicable intrusions into their apartments, missing personal belongings, and rude late-night encounters with their landlord. Detectives in adjoining counties shortly started canvassing for unsolved disappearances that could be linked to him. Records of his properties indicated Brennan held buildings in 4 New York boroughs and several areas of New Jersey, which broadened the investigation enormously. "We don't believe Carol Williams was his first victim, or his last," said Manhattan District Attorney Elena Vasquez at a press conference. "We're dealing with a predator who operated undetected for decades. The true scale of his crimes may never be fully known." For the Williams family, the arrest brought a flood of complicated emotions. The assurance Carol was gone extinguished the smallest glimmer of hope, but also provided long-delayed answers. "We knew," Michael Williams said, his voice breaking as he addressed reporters. "In our hearts, we knew she wasn't returning. But knowing what occurred, knowing who had done this, there's a weird sort of peace in that, even amidst the horror." His mother, Margaret Williams, now 81, spoke softly. "Now my daughter can rest," she whispered, "and so can I." Hal Brennan, as of September 2023, is in jail awaiting trial on several charges, among which are first-degree murder for Carol Williams, Lucia Mendez, and Aisha Johnson. The prosecutors call the evidence overwhelming. His own journal writings, forensic reports, and statements by victims of surveillance create a scenario difficult to deny. Despite Brennan's not guilty plea, insiders report that his attorneys are likely to go for a mental health defense. Law experts believe the 2024 trial will be a near certainty for conviction, one that will keep Brennan behind bars for the rest of his life. It's a mixed bag of closure for the Williams family. They've been to every early hearing, finally able to meet the man's eyes who took so much from them. "We can go visit a grave now," Michael said. "Not Carol's, but at least a place that remembers her. Somewhere we can put flowers down and know the truth. That's more than we've had for 30 years. Brennan's case has already altered police practices nationwide. Police departments are reopening cold cases, particularly cases involving missing tenants or landlords with unlimited access. The NYPD has even established a task force to track possible predators who could be posing behind property management positions. If you enjoyed this story as much as I did, and as hauntingly, please pass along this video to friends who enjoy true crime and justice stories. For every share, Victims such as Carol are less likely to be forgotten, and others can become aware of the warning signs before tragedy occurs. And off you go. Let me know what time it is where you're viewing. Leave your city and time in the comments below. It's always interesting to look at how wide this community reaches. People from everywhere, connected by one thing, seeking truth and closure.